Your mind is a factory, and if you were born after 1985, your factory was built with a fundamental design flaw that people born in the 1960s never had to deal with. This is not about nostalgia or generational warfare. This is about understanding why your brain breaks under pressure that would have been considered ordinary 40 years ago, and more importantly, how to rebuild your mental architecture using principles that generation discovered by accident, but you can engineer by design. There is something genuinely different about people who grew up in the 60s and 70s. You have seen it. That uncle who can sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for his phone. That older colleague who can focus on a single task for hours without her attention fragmenting into 1,000 pieces. That neighbor who seems immune to the anxiety that permeates every conversation among people under 40. You have probably dismissed this as them being from a simpler time, as if simplicity was somehow handed to them instead of constructed through the daily friction of their environment. But here is what nobody is telling you. Their mental strength is not a personality trait they were born with. It is architectural. It is the result of growing up in an environment that forced their brains to build different neural pathways. And those pathways are still accessible to you if you understand the engineering behind them. Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing by understanding a simple principle. The conditions under which something is built determine its structural integrity. A car assembled on a chaotic factory floor, with workers constantly interrupted, and switching between tasks will never match the quality of a car built on an optimized assembly line, where each worker masters one process completely before moving to the next. Your mind works exactly the same way. The 1960s generation grew up in a factory environment that required them to build mental processes we no longer develop because our environment no longer demands them. This is not about technology being bad or the past being better. This is about recognizing that your brain is producing exactly what the modern environment has programmed it to produce. Fragmented attention, instant gratification seeking, and an inability to sit with difficulty without reaching for an escape hatch. Let me give you the science first, then we will talk about what the Stoics knew 2,000 years ago that perfectly explains this phenomenon. And finally, I will give you the exact protocol to reprogram your factory. Your brain has a system called the default mode network, the DMN, which activates when you are not focused on external tasks. For the 1960s generation, this network developed in an environment of prolonged boredom. They would sit on a bus for an hour with nothing but their thoughts. They would wait in line at the bank with no phone to scroll. They would have entire Saturday afternoons with nothing scheduled and no entertainment accessible except what they could create themselves. This was not character building in some vague motivational sense. This was literal brain building. Every time they sat with boredom instead of immediately seeking stimulation, their DMN strengthened its ability to process information, consolidate memories, and develop self-awareness. They were running mental software that required them to generate their own dopamine instead of having it delivered on demand. Here is the critical mechanism you need to understand. Dopamine is not pleasure. It is anticipation of reward. Your brain releases it not when you get what you want, but when you are working toward what you want. The 1960s generation grew up in an environment where the gap between wanting something and getting it was measured in hours, days, or weeks. You wanted to know something, you had to go to the library, find the book, read through it. You wanted to see a movie. You had to wait until it came to your local theater, then physically go there at a specific time. You wanted to talk to someone. You had to find them or call them at a time when they might be home. Every single one of these delays forced their brains to strengthen the neural pathways associated with delayed gratification, sustained effort, and tolerance for frustration. They were building a mental assembly line where each step had to be completed before moving to the next. And that process created structural resilience that you are trying to build with motivational videos and productivity apps. Now compare that to your factory. You want something, you get it instantly, or you get frustrated. You are bored for 30 seconds. You reach for your phone. You start a difficult task. Your brain immediately suggests checking email, watching a video, ordering food, anything except sitting with the difficulty. This is not weakness. This is programming. Your environment has programmed your brain to seek the path of least resistance, because that path is always available. The 1960s generation did not have stronger willpower or better character. They had an environment that gave them no choice but to build tolerance for delay, difficulty, and discomfort. And here is what nobody wants to admit. You cannot build that tolerance while simultaneously having access to infinite escape routes. You cannot strengthen a muscle you never use, and you cannot use a muscle if every time it needs to engage, there is a button you can press to avoid using it. The Stoics understood this perfectly without knowing anything about dopamine or neural pathways. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, with access to every pleasure and comfort imaginable, deliberately chose discomfort as training. He would sleep on the floor. He would fast when food was abundant. He would practice premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, imagining worst-case scenarios not to torture himself, but to build tolerance for adversity before it arrived. The Stoics knew what modern neuroscience confirms. Your capacity for difficulty is not fixed at birth, it is built through exposure. Every time you choose difficulty when ease is available, you are quite literally rewiring your brain to handle harder things. Every time you choose ease when difficulty would serve you better, you are programming your factory to produce fragility. Here is where this gets interesting and where Henry Ford comes back into the picture. Ford did not invent the automobile. He invented the system that made automobiles accessible to everyone. Before Ford, cars were handcrafted luxuries. After Ford, they were systematically produced necessities. He took a product that required wealth and privilege and democratized it through superior process design. The mental strength you see in the 1960s generation is exactly the same. It is not a luxury they were born with, it is a product of their manufacturing environment. And just like Ford proved, you can build better cars with better systems. You can build better mental architecture with better systems. You do not need to have been born in the 1960s. You need to recreate the conditions that built their mental resilience and eliminate the conditions that are currently building your mental fragility. Let me break down the exact environmental differences that matter. First, information scarcity versus information abundance. The 1960s generation had to work to acquire knowledge. This meant their brains developed strong filtering mechanisms because they could not process everything. So they had to choose what mattered. Your generation has access to infinite information, but no filtering system, which means your brain is in constant triage mode, trying to process everything and mastering nothing. The result is, you know a little about everything and can execute deeply on almost nothing. Second, social interaction friction versus social interaction ease. They had to physically see people or call them at scheduled times. This created natural boundaries around social obligations and forced them to be present during interactions because there was no phone to check. You have constant access to everyone, which means you are never fully present with anyone because your attention is always being pulled toward the next interaction. Third, delayed gratification as default versus instant gratification as default. They lived in a world where waiting was not a choice, it was reality. You live in a world where waiting feels like a system malfunction because everything is designed to eliminate delay. These are not small differences. These are architectural differences that shape how your brain processes reality. Now here is the part that will either excite you or terrify you. You cannot change your environment back to the 1960s, but you can engineer microenvironments that recreate the same neural demands. This is not about romanticizing the past or rejecting technology. This is about understanding that certain mental capacities require certain conditions to develop. And if you want those capacities, you need to build those conditions. Let me give you the protocol. This is not theory. This is engineering. First, create mandatory boredom windows. Set aside 30 minutes every day where you do nothing. No phone, no book, no music, no podcast, no input of any kind. Just sit. Your brain will panic. It will generate anxiety, urgent tasks you suddenly remember, physical discomfort, anything to make you stop. Do not stop. This is not meditation. You are not trying to clear your mind. You are training your default mode network to function without external input, exactly like the 1960s generation trained theirs by default. After 2 weeks, you will notice something. Your brain starts generating ideas, processing emotions, and solving problems during these windows. This is not magic. This is your DMN finally being allowed to do its job instead of being constantly interrupted. Second, install friction between impulse and action. Every time you want to check your phone, make yourself wait 60 seconds. Every time you want to order something online, make yourself wait 24 hours. Every time you want to quit a difficult task, make yourself continue for 10 more minutes. You are not trying to eliminate these behaviors. You are inserting delay between wanting and getting. This delay is where discipline is built. The 1960s generation had this delay built into their environment. You have to build it deliberately. Start with one behavior. Master the delay, then expand to others. This is Ford's assembly line principle applied to habit formation. Master one station completely before adding the next. Third, practice voluntary discomfort. Once per week, do something uncomfortable that you could easily avoid. Take a cold shower when you could take a warm one. Skip a meal when you could eat. Sit on the floor when you could sit on the couch. Walk somewhere you could drive. The specific discomfort does not matter. What matters is choosing difficulty when ease is available. This is premeditatio malorum in action. You are training your nervous system to interpret discomfort as information instead of emergency. The 1960s generation developed this tolerance accidentally because their environment regularly presented discomfort with no easy exit. You have to choose it deliberately because your environment is designed to eliminate all discomfort. Fourth, commit to single tasking. Choose one task, set a timer for 90 minutes, and do nothing but that task until the timer ends. No email, no messages, no quick checks of anything. Your brain will offer you 1,000 urgent reasons why you need to stop and attend to something else. Ignore all of them unless the building is literally on fire. This is not about productivity, although you will become more productive. This is about training sustained attention, which is the foundation of every complex skill. The 1960s generation developed this capacity because they had no choice. When you were reading a book, you were reading a book. When you were having a conversation, you were having a conversation. There was no constant interruption competing for your attention. You have to recreate that environment artificially by eliminating all interruption options during focused work. Fifth, eliminate all notifications except the ones that represent actual emergencies. Not just mute them, eliminate them. Turn off every badge, banner, and alert that is not directly related to someone's safety or health. Your brain has been trained to interpret every notification as urgent because they all trigger the same neural response. This keeps you in a constant state of low-level anxiety and prevents you from ever fully engaging with whatever is in front of you. The 1960s generation lived in a world where urgent information came through phone calls or people physically showing up. Everything else could wait. You need to recreate that information hierarchy. Actual emergencies get through immediately. Everything else waits until you check it deliberately. Here is what you will notice after 30 days of this protocol. You will be able to sit with difficulty longer. You will be able to focus on single tasks deeper. You will be able to tolerate delay better. You will be able to handle boredom without panic. These are not vague improvements. These are measurable changes in how your nervous system responds to challenge. You are quite literally rebuilding the neural architecture that the 1960s generation developed by default. And here is the beautiful part. Once these pathways are built, they compound. The longer you can focus, the more complex skills you can master. The better you tolerate delay, the bigger goals you can pursue. The more you can sit with discomfort, the fewer things control you. But let me tell you what will happen if you do not do this. You will continue to wonder why older generations seem to have something you lack. You will continue to feel like you should be stronger, more focused, more resilient, while simultaneously being unable to sit still for 10 minutes without reaching for distraction. You will watch people born in the 1960s handle pressure that breaks you and attribute it to them being from a different time, instead of recognizing that they are running different software that you can install if you are willing to recreate the conditions that built it. This is not about blame or shame. This is about engineering. Your brain is a factory. It produces what its environment programs it to produce. If you do not like what it is producing, change the programming. The Stoics had a concept called amor fati, love of fate. But this was not passive acceptance. It was active engagement with reality as it is, rather than as you wish it were. The reality is this: you were not born in the 1960s. You cannot go back to that environment, but you can study what that environment built and engineer those same results through deliberate practice. You can choose to sit with boredom when entertainment is available. You can choose to delay gratification when instant gratification is accessible. You can choose discomfort when comfort is one click away. Every time you make these choices, you are building the mental architecture that the 1960s generation developed accidentally. Henry Ford said that whether you think you can or you think you cannot, you are right. Your mind is producing exactly what you have programmed it to produce. The 1960s generation programmed their minds in an environment of scarcity, delay, and friction. You are programming yours in an environment of abundance, instant access, and frictionless ease. Neither environment is morally superior, but they produce different results. If you want the mental strength that comes from the first environment while living in the second, you have to engineer the conditions deliberately. This is not about rejecting modernity. It is about understanding that certain mental capacities require certain training conditions, and those conditions are no longer provided by default. Let me give you one more principle that ties this together. The Stoics practiced negative visualization, imagining losing everything they valued, not to be pessimistic, but to train their minds to handle loss before it happened. This is the same principle as voluntary discomfort. You expose yourself to a controlled version of difficulty so that when uncontrolled difficulty arrives, your nervous system recognizes it as familiar instead of catastrophic. The 1960s generation got this training automatically because their environment regularly presented difficulty. A plan failed, you had to adapt. Information was wrong, you had to figure it out. Something broke, you had to fix it or do without. Each of these micro-difficulties trained resilience. Your environment eliminates almost all micro-difficulties, which means you never train for macro-difficulties. Then, when actual adversity arrives, your nervous system interprets it as system failure instead of normal operation. This brings us to the final piece. The 1960s generation did not just have mental strength, they had mental flexibility. They could handle uncertainty because uncertainty was normal. They could adapt to changing circumstances because adaptation was required daily. They could tolerate not knowing because information was not instantly available. Your generation has been trained to interpret uncertainty as anxiety, changing circumstances as chaos, and not knowing as personal failure. This is not because you are weaker. It is because your factory never installed the equipment to handle these conditions. But equipment can be installed. Pathways can be built. You can train your nervous system to recognize difficulty as information instead of emergency by exposing yourself to controlled difficulty regularly. Start today. Right now, after you finish this video, sit for 10 minutes with no input. Do nothing. Feel the discomfort. Notice how your brain generates urgency around tasks that were not urgent 5 minutes ago. Notice the physical sensation of wanting to move, check something, do anything except sit. Do not act on any of it, just observe. This is your baseline. This is what your factory currently produces when external input stops. Over the next 30 days, extend this window and add the other protocols. Track what changes, not in vague feelings, but in specific capacities. How long can you focus before your attention fragments? How long can you sit with discomfort before reaching for relief? How much delay can you tolerate between wanting something and getting it? These are your metrics. Improve them systematically the same way Ford improved production metrics systematically. If you have made it this far, I already know something important about you. You are not looking for motivation or inspiration. You are looking for understanding and systems. You want to know how things actually work so you can make them work better. This is exactly the mindset that built everything worth building. And it is the mindset that will rebuild your mental architecture. This channel exists for people who understand that transformation is not about events or breakthroughs. It is about engineering better processes and running them consistently. Every week, I break down one aspect of how your mind works, and more importantly, how to make it work for you instead of against you. If that approach makes sense to you, subscribe. Not because I am asking, but because you deserve access to tools that actually work instead of empty promises that feel good but change nothing. The next video is already ready, and I can promise you it will add another critical piece to your mental engineering project.